Good morning and welcome to the 104th episode of the Veritas fact-finding mission. And today I'm joined by my special guest, Mr. Fabrice Houdart. Good morning, Fabrice.
Good morning, Anthony, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
In each episode of our fact-finding series, we go on the ground and speak to industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. In this series, and with everything we do, we believe the facts empower investors and that better information leads to better investment decisions. By way of background, my name is Anthony Scilipoti, and I'm the president and CEO of Veritas, which is an independent equity research firm based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm proud to say we've celebrated now 22 years, 100% employee owned and operated. Quick disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. While I love all our guests, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we do not agree with at all. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Monsieur Houdart. He's a professor at the Georgetown University, and he has developed, and he's the founder and executive director of the Association of LGBTQ plus corporate directors, helping bring LGBTQ plus diversity to the most senior levels of organizations, the board of directors. He is L'Oreal Global Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board member and an advisor to the National Association of Corporate Directors Center for Inclusive Governance. He's really been a champion for the cause, which I'm going to characterize as what we'd call DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion. He's previously worked on the UN World Bank system. He's had a number of roles with as a human rights officer at the United Nations in New York. He worked on free and equal and unprecedented United Nations campaign. He's co-authored and led other documents on this study, and he writes a weekly email that comes out, a blog that talks about global issues related to LGBTQ, inclusiveness, etc. But most especially why I think this is going to be so relevant to us today is he talks about how that relates to corporations, and most especially the most senior levels, the board. So Fabrice, as we get started, I'd like to ask all our guests, why don't you tell us about yourself, why you do what you do, and what drove you to start this Corporate Directors Foundation?
Well, first of all, again, thank you very much for having me. As you mentioned, I was in the UN system for 20 years. So, I'm a civil servant. I didn't know much about the private sector. And then finally, I managed to escape. And when I escaped, I worked for a small think tank, and I was looking a tiny bit at board diversity, which was an emerging topic. And I don't know if you remember, but Goldman Sachs said no IPO without diverse board member, including LGBT board members, right? Including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then shortly after, California passed a law, which has been repealed since then, and we can talk about it, which kind of imposed some diversity, very low-level diversity quotas in a publicly listed company in California. And then eventually NASDAQ came out with that listing rule, which is pretty famous, which is also being challenged in court, which mandated disclosure on the diversity of boards. And so, I was looking at this, and one of the things that I realized is that every single minority has kind of come to the conclusion that specifically in the United States, you cannot really bark in front of the headquarters of companies saying you should have women on board, right? What you do is that you push exceptional talent, and you say, by the way, this CFO that has experience in a company that brought a drug to market happens to be a woman, and that's how you improve numbers in the boardroom. So, the Latino have it, it's called the Latino Corporate Directors Association. Women have women on board, and the 50-50 initiative, and African-American have the Leadership Executive Council. LGBT people did not have that. So in June last year, I created that nonprofit, and I launched it officially at JP Morgan in September. And then, believe it or not, our Canadian friend created a chapter shortly after. So now there is a chapter in Canada, and there is the association in the US. And really what we do is that we tell boards, look, we have those amazing candidates that really would fit your opening. And by the way, they happen to be LGBT.
I love it. So I think the timing of our session here couldn't have been better. Recently, obviously, Silicon Valley Bank in the news, having the big bank run, and swirling around various media outlets is this notion that one of the reasons why Silicon Valley Bank collapsed was because it had way more attention on wokeness than it had on risk management. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, what is difficult is that, at the beginning of the podcast, you talk about the fact that the facts is what is important to shareholders. Yeah. And you're right? And so, but the problem is that everything that happens also happens in a political context. And so very often the politics will try to make sense of the facts in order to push a specific agenda. So immediately after SVB collapsed, the Wall Street Journal and some serious publications said, well, look, the real issue with SVB is that they were paying too much attention to a woke agenda, including diversifying their board, instead of paying attention to risks. Well, I think people can do the two things at the same time, right? They can pay attention to ensuring that there is fairness and some level of diversity in their companies while paying attention to risk. I moved last week and I'm still doing that podcast today. I'm still opening my boxes. You can do two things at the same time. But it was definitely, it was a weird conversation last week in which a lot of actors, including political candidates, went on television and said, well, look, the problem with America today is that companies are being pushed in paying attention to things that have nothing to do with their business. And so they need to recenter themselves on the business. So, as you can imagine, I took a little bit umbrage to the conversation. Now, a fun fact is that indeed, there is a lesbian on the board of SVB, She happens to be the acting CEO of Walgreens at the moment. She's a brilliant board member. I'm not qualified to discuss whether the board took wrong decisions, but the fact that there was a lesbian on the board was not missed by the critics of D&I in America.
So, how do we fix this? You mentioned a number of trends that are taking place. The California law, there is NASDAQ mandating disclosure of boards. Various different states are taking different views on quota. Is that going to solve things?
Well, that's very interesting, right? Because in France, 11 years ago, the regulator stepped in and he said, every board has to have 40% women. It was a law called Copé-Zimmermann, which actually was pushed by conservatives, right? Copé and Zimmermann are conservative politicians. So the law passed, 11 years later, there is 44% women on board in France. And it has been a success, right? When companies were asked 10 years on, do you think it was a good thing for the regulator to step in? They said yes. And they say, women have been adding value to the board. The reason why the regulator stepped in France is because he can, right? There is no constitutional objection to it. And the reason he stepped in is because he knows that it's extremely difficult for boards to self-diversify. And the reason is linked to the very specific way in which board members are recruited. Usually to get a board seat, you have to know a board member. And who knows a board member are people which are in that in-group, right? And very often women were outside of these groups. So the regulator in France said, I'm going to step in. A fun fact is that the European Union this year passed a law which covers all of the European Union that says 40% representation on board. Almost nobody opposed it. And what it did is that for countries like Greece that had a 30% quota, the quota went up to 40%. Now in the United States, you cannot do that, as you know. It is anti-constitutional. There is a specific allergy of Americans to quotas, you know, which have sociological and historical roots, and so you have to find a different way, right? And the way we do it in the US is we say, well, first of all, there should be transparency about who is on the board, and I think everybody on this call can agree that it is relevant to the shareholder to know who is on the board. You know, do you only have men on the board? If you only have men on the board, it says something about your company, right? I love to talk about charter communications in the United States. Charter communication brings the internet to New York. You know, they are actually my internet provider. It's called Spectrum. They have 14 board members. They have 1 woman. You know, what does it say in 2023? If you're a company and you only have 1 woman on your board, you have 14 board members and 1 woman. What it says is that you basically, first of all, you don't have very important voices at the table. But second of all, the message you're sending is, look, you know, we've looked around and we could not find 1 woman that was qualified to sit. I mean, we could find 1 woman that was qualified to sit with us. Like, it's a really bad message. And if I had managed to deal with money better and I had savings, I would not invest my money in charter communications, because I think it sends a message about, you know, what is the company internal culture, you know, how they are preparing themselves for the future. And I think, you know, for NASDAQ to say shareholders should be able to know who's on their board is not crazy, right? It's not out there. It's pretty much what NASDAQ should do, which is to regulate the information that is provided by the company it is listing. And you know, it is still being challenged in court. And if you want, I'll talk about it a little bit. You know, what is interesting is that the guy that is challenging it in court is called Jay Bloom. He's a famous conservative activist. He's also the one that is suing universities for affirmative action at the Supreme Court. So you know, the two are actually kind of linked.
But does having a quota fix things? Because if we just, you know, poll, if corporate America, corporate global just were to bring in 40%, let's call it diverse, onto every board, does that necessarily make them better?
Well, look, I mean, you know, first of all, it's not a question, right? Because in the United States, you cannot have quotas. And it's not going, you know, the judge on AB 979, I was actually an expert witness on the case. And what I was going to say in court was I was going to say, look, you know, board have a difficulty self-diversifying. So there's a good reason why the regulator has to step in. You know, I was ready, I had already picked my outfit, and then the judge, you know, instead of calling us in Los Angeles, he said, look, that's not constitutional. So there is no question about whether quotas work in the US or not. But in France, it did work, right? I mean, companies will report that they are better because they have women on board. And, you know, by themselves, they would not have self-diversified. Now, the United States is also a different context, right? Because of the racial tensions in the United States, there has always been a discussion about representation. And in fact, I would say that's an advantage for the United States, which is the United States is conscious that if you don't make an effort, you end up only having straight white guys in position of power. And it's normal, right? I mean, I think there is a saying in the United States, you might have noticed that I have a slight accent, I'm not a native, but I think there is a say that power never concedes power without a demand, right? Why would you give a seat to someone that is not in the in-group? Instead, you are probably going to select someone that is going to be able to scratch your back down the road, right? It's normal. That's the way it works in politics. That's the way it works in business. That's the way it works in higher education. You know, you tend to select people that are in your network because it benefits you.
Yeah. So we look at this current situation and say, because I think your foundation that you've set up is trying to address this issue, because as you and I have been speaking about, it's not, and I think you would agree, if tomorrow that board that you just mentioned that only has the one female went to 40% females, that in and of itself wouldn't make it better, because those females and or minorities need to be qualified. And so it's a two-pronged issue, not just the inclusivity, but also finding candidates. And so maybe you can talk to that.
Well, look, it's very interesting. When you ask existing board member, a third of them will say that representative from underrepresented groups, meaning women, Latino, African Americans, LGBT people, are unneeded and unqualified. And I love to joke that if 1/3 of them are willing to say that in a survey, it probably means that 75% of them think that, right? And that's a myth. That's a myth, right? The truth is that you can find women, African American, Latino, and LGBT people that have made it to the top of business and are extremely qualified. In fact, I would argue that anybody in that generation that made it to the top of business while being part of one of those groups tend to be an overachiever, right? I always say, my candidates are not very interested in DEI. They tend to be very boring, type A personality that will read the board packet from head to cover, right? But the issue is that they are difficult to identify, right? They are less visible. They tend to not socialize in the same way. So to give you a very unfair caricature, typically people from in the Fortune 500 board are picked up because they are on the board of the PGA or they are vacationing in Martha's Vineyard. Well, gay people do, very rarely are on the board of the PGA, and they tend to vacation in Provincetown. So what you have to do is that you have to make sure that the two groups are connected, and you have to showcase the talent. When board members are telling you, well, I would love to have diversity, but I can only find straight white guys that have the knowledge and the skills. Well, my job is to say, well, look, I have this lesbian that lives in Boston. She happens to be the chief medical officer of a big pharmaceutical company, and she would be perfect for you. And by the way, she happens to be a lesbian. And you can report it on your NASDAQ disclosure matrix as having diversity on your board.
But let's talk about some of this disclosure, because I'm heterosexual male, white, I fit that bucket that we're trying to address. But I don't say in my disclosure that I'm, heterosexual. Why should it matter that someone's sexual orientation? Doesn't that create more, I don't know, stress, for lack of a better word, and just let's leave it to, this is someone with different, with different background, someone's obviously a different race, that's visible, that someone that has a different, that is a different sex, that being male or female, and or associates as someone else. Maybe you could address that.
No, that's a very good question. And I have to tell you, I have a brother in France, he happens to be in the executive committee of a very large company. And he says to me, you American, you love to talk about your feelings and give hugs to each other, but we are serious people doing business. We don't talk about sex at work, right? However, what he misses is that sexual orientation, because of society's historical homophobia, is an incredible determinant in my identity. I'll tell you something. When I started working at the World Bank, I was a young man. I was 22. When my turn would come to speak at a review meeting, I would blush and I would sweat because I had integrated the fact that I was an inferior species to the guys in the room. And for good reasons, right? I mean, if you grow up all of your youth convinced that you are worthless, that there is something disgusting about you, you cannot talk about it to your teacher, you cannot talk about it to your priest, you cannot talk about it to your parents. Believe me, it doesn't leave you magically when you get to 18 years old. That's a baggage you carry with you for the rest of your life, including in the workplace. It creates huge bottlenecks to success, to not have that self-confidence. And the only antidote to it is to be proud of who you are, right? To repeat yourself regularly that you are worthy and that you deserve a seat at the table. A lot of my candidates, particularly women and lesbians, are like, yeah, I don't know if it's for me, I'm already lucky I get to the top of business, the boardroom seems to be, a very exclusive place. And I tell them, I say, nobody thinks like that. You're the only one that thinks like that, right? Lesbians tend to see themselves as not worthy, even when they have incredible accomplishment. You know, one of my board members, who used to be on the board of Eli Lilly, she has a Nobel Prize in chemistry. How many other board members do you think on the board have a Nobel Prize in chemistry? And yet, those women tend to see themselves as not worthy. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that we are victims, but what I'm saying is that my sexual orientation has been an incredible determinant in my life. It has been a determinant of how I interact with the world, where I feel comfortable, where I can live, you know, my relationship with my children. You know, it is still now, even though I'm 45, it is still now, because of society, it has been the biggest determinant of what happened in my life. And so to say, well, look, this is not relevant to the workplace, is crazy, right? It's a little bit like if you were saying that that your skills, you know, are not relevant to the workplace, right? This is a huge part of who you are. And so I think as much as being African-American is a huge determinant in African-American experience in the workplace, sexual orientation should not, but it is a huge determinant of how you feel in the workplace, how you feel in the board, and whether you have a chance to get a board seat. You know, I just carried out a survey of 200 existing and aspiring LGBT board members, and the biggest impediment is that they don't know people in the boardroom. And they don't know people in the boardroom for some good reasons, right? If you were out in that generation, you didn't make it to the boardroom. And for the men that made it to the boardroom, so many of them died of HIV, right? And so ultimately, it is a huge determinant of your chance at getting a board seat. And we have to remedy to that. And the way I remedy to that is I give visibility to my candidates.
So the mission of your organization is to identify the top most qualified candidates that may have LGBTQ plus characteristics, and therefore put those forward to be board members, right?
Look, my dream is for me to have the chair of a nominating and governance committee or a recruiter call me and say, well, look, this company is pre-IPO, it's going to go to IPO soon. They are looking for someone that is a CFO that could serve as chair of the audit committee. Do you have a name to suggest to us so that we can diversify our slate of candidates? And I'm like, here are 3 names, you know, do whatever you want with them, it's free. And you know, and I cross my finger that one of them makes it to the boardroom. And what it means is that in 30 years' time, you know, there are LGBT people in the boardroom.
Do you think this is something that's going to change tomorrow? Let's try to look forward. Do you see that there's that there's positive momentum, and where do you see us 5-10 years from now?
Well, you know, I'll be super frank with you, Anthony, is that this is a bit perceived as a bullshit topic. You know, a lot of people are like, okay, you know, actually, I was noting this morning, some Spencer Stewart recruiter was interviewed in an article in the LA Times about Latinos, right? And representation of Latinos in the boardroom. And she said, well, look, we have to be really careful because how much are we going to cut and dissect the population? I am a blonde. How many blonde people should be in the boardroom? And, you know, I was a bit shocked that she dare say that. You know, I think a lot of people think it, but the fact that she dare say that as a quote in the LA Times was pretty surprising. But you know, so a lot of people have a bit of difficulty saying to their recruiter, look, I would like LGBT candidates on my slate. So it's a bit of an uphill battle for me. But the way I address it is very different, right? The way I address it is that I try to connect LGBT people to people in the boardroom, right? So that they create relationship. I try to equip them in terms of networking, right? Being part of the National Association of Corporate Directors. You know, I also help them sometimes present themselves, because if you don't have a role model that has been in the boardroom before you, sometimes it's difficult to know how to apprehend your board search. So, you know, I'm not in the business of advocacy. I'm not in the business of forcing people onto board. I'm in the business of giving visibility to exceptional individuals in our community.
I love it. I want to go to the point of, and by the way, if anyone has any questions, please hover down to the bottom of your of the page and just type on the Q&A button your question. I'll make sure that Fabrice addresses it. Fabrice, one of the things that's always caught me is, you know, when I meet someone, I judge them for who they are at the moment I see them, I meet them, or on the phone, or I read their resume, or I read their CV. And if it almost like it's a little bit, if they put on that CV African American, it's like, why? Like it makes it what it does. Doesn't that further foster racism and sort of prejudice and so on by having, you know, on the for example, the resume would say LGBTQ plus for an individual, and now all of a sudden that's going to be, you know, this, it then puts them in a special bucket, if you will.
Well, look, I'm going to be honest with you. You know, the real question is not so much how you're going to read the resume. The real question is, who are you going to meet? Who is going to be in front of you? You know, you're right. You tell me, look, I judge people from who they are, but when they are in front of you, and the question is, who are they? Who is in front of you, right? Because I'll tell you something. I'm a gay single father, French, and you know when I'm the most comfortable is when I'm surrounded by gay single French man, right? Gay single French gay man, right? That's when I'm the most comfortable, because I tend to have little straight people in my life, and I tend to have little women in my life. Now I'm making efforts, right, to try to diversify my friends, because I understand that my life is incredibly boring if I surround myself with people that are exclusively like me. But the truth is that if you look at my LinkedIn, you'd be amazed by the percentage of people on my LinkedIn that are gay. And you'd be amazed by the percentage of them that are gay white men. You know, one of the big challenges I have with my associates—
would you say that it's high or that it's not high?
Super high, super high, super high, very high. Super high. Very high, right? And in fact, one of the challenges I have with the association is that I have historically networked with gay white men. And now I have to try to get African-American candidates. I have to try to get lesbians. And so I have to make an effort to go outside of my comfort zone. And I think that's the case for most of the boards. The candidates that come to them tend to be people that are in their network, and they tend to be people that are exactly like them. Because African-American tend to socialize with African-American because it's most comfortable. Latinos tend to socialize with Latinos because that's where it's most comfortable. And so, you know, that's a stupid thing we do, right? Which is surrounding ourselves with people like us. But you know, when you're a gay person, you're always thinking, am I going to be uncomfortable? And you want to make it comfortable for yourself. Now, I'll tell you something really interesting, is that one time I traveled to Milan when I was working for the UN, and I went to meet Marco Bizzarri, who is the CEO of Gucci. Yeah. And I said exactly the same thing that I told you to him. I said, look, you know, people want to be surrounded by people that are like him. And he said to me, he said, that's funny, because I love to surround myself with people that are different from me. And, you know, I paused for a minute and I responded to him and I said, that's why you're the CEO of Gucci and I'm just a civil servant at the UN. You know, people that are successful in life are people that go outside of their comfort zone. And what we are telling those boards is, look, go a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Why don't you consider a candidate that might not be the most comfortable candidate? You know, I mean, I'll be honest with you, you know, I am misogynistic and to some extent I am racist, right? I have to make an effort to challenge my prejudice. And my prejudice are deeply rooted in the way I have been socializing.
And your upbringing, your experiences, etc. And so you're right. We do this, you know, on a nationality basis. I may socialize more with Italians because they have a similar background. They have been brought up in similar values. So I feel most comfortable. And I'm a little bit like your, not actually quite a bit like your Gucci CEO. I look at my organization and even the friends I keep. I want to have a diverse friendship. I also want to have a diverse organization, because if everybody thinks like me, we're not going to find better answers.
Really?
We have
look,
to.
If you take the political outside of the equation, which is, you know, conservative trying to manipulate the fear of others in that specific case, but if you take the politics out of it, I think as human beings we can agree that there is value in diversity and that there is value in fairness, right? Which is everybody having a chance to showcase their skills and qualifications. But something I will add to you, which is a specific component also about the boardroom, which we cannot ignore, is that the boardroom doesn't like conflict. and the boardroom doesn't like dissent, you know. And so very often they look at underrepresented groups as having the potential of being disruptive and maybe, you know, getting in the way of consensus building in the boardroom. You know, that's not completely true. And in fact, one could argue that some level of conflict in the boardroom is useful, right?
Yes.
But there, you know, what is very interesting is that LGBT candidates, what I see through my studies, right, is that LGBT candidates tend to be perceived as untrustworthy and as disruptive. And it's very much rooted in the historical experience of LGBT people, right? They were criminals, they were breaking social norms. And so there is a bit that idea of like, look, if you're a lesbian and living with another woman, chances are you're going to be a clown in the boardroom. And so I have to constantly reiterate, look, my candidates are boring. They are not going to be championing DEI causes or, you know, force a woke agenda on the company. What they care about is exactly the same thing that the other board members care about, which is the financial and business performance of the company.
Outstanding. Can you just, there was a blog that you wrote, and I took note of it. There's an individual named Jay Bloom, and I think is very important to this discussion. Maybe you could provide some color.
Yeah, you know, Jay Bloom is a plaintiff against affirmative action at the Supreme Court, which were quotas, you know, ethnic and racial quotas in universities. And he was a plaintiff against AB 979 in California. You know, he won. But I don't know if the Secretary of State in California will appeal, but so far he won. And he's a plaintiff against NASDAQ. You know, he's funded mostly by conservative political groups in Washington, D.C., right? And his argument is to say that this is stifling competition, that NASDAQ is trying to force companies to select board members that are not the best board member for them. NASDAQ response is to say, look, what we want is to give information to shareholders, right? So the judge will have to decide, is NASDAQ, you know, getting in the way of the freedom of companies to select their board member, or is it working towards transparency for shareholders, which is a legitimate goal for NASDAQ? You know, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you cannot take it into isolation in what you described earlier on as this very polarized context in the United States. You know, the United States has gone a little crazy over the past 10 years. And so everything now is kind of instrumentalized as a way to oppose a woke left that is trying to destroy family and tradition, to a conservative right that is trying to support, you know, stability and the Constitution, you know. And so everything tends to be instrumentalized in that context. I have to say that sometimes I get really tired with the United States, and that's why in my newsletter I always write about global news, because when you are in the middle of it, it really becomes a little bit like an obsession, right? Everything is about that woke, that culture war. But when you look in the bigger context, it's only a glimpse in the history of the United States. And the United States is a very young country, which is still trying to figure itself out. And you have to have a little bit of, you know, step back a little bit and understand, okay, well, they are going through their teenage years, and it's, you know, they are going to get out of it.
Well, let's just hope that while they're in the teenage years, they don't have a huge rebellion. The teenager, you know, has a huge Harry Carey, because otherwise that's going to cause a huge problem. Okay, last point. If anybody has any questions, again, go down to the bottom of the page and type them out, and I'll make sure that Fabrice handles them. Quick questions I like to ask all our guests here as we wrap up here. Your favorite podcast?
Oh, that's so funny that you say that, because you sent me that question ahead of time and I didn't think about it. But, you know, I love a podcast called The C Word with Lena Durham and another host. And and they talk about women that went down in history as bad women, right? And they try to uncover the story behind it, and it's pretty hilarious. And you know, I was moving recently, and I was packing my boxes, and I was listening to it, and I really like it. You know, I wish I had more time to listen to a podcast, but I really like that podcast called The Sea World.
Good. Your favorite book?
Wow, that's a really good question. I should have thought about that too. You know, I really like the El Gato Pardo, which is I don't know how to translate in English, but it's this book by the Count of Lampedusa that talks about a man in a changing era, right? And I think, you know, the pace of change has accelerated a lot, and sometimes it's difficult for me to recognize myself in the world around me. And I like to see it as not the fact that the world is going crazy, but the fact that I'm aging and that the world is not looking like I used to, like it used to, and I'm uncomfortable in it. But it does happen to every single generation. And so sometimes reading that book is a bit of a comfort.
Can you say it again? It's in Italian. I can
In
translate.
Italian, it's El Gatto Pardo. In French, it's Le Guépard. It's an animal.
El gato is the cat.
Yeah, Gatto Pardo is a wild cat, right? It's a wild cat.
That's yeah. The title doesn't necessarily mean much. I think it's just, yeah. The pardo is just a white.
It's the name of the aristocrat that is losing control over modern Italy, and his nickname is El Gatto Pardo, and his real name is the Count of Lampedusa. Right. That's a lot how I feel, you know, that sometimes I don't recognize myself in the modern.
And that's a very deep point, you know, and it's not that the world changed, it's that you changed and you look through it differently.
Completely. And, you know, I'll tell you something really funny is that I used to love men fashion. And now if I open a magazine, I'm like, how would anybody wear that? And it's not, it's not that this is bad taste. It's that the world has evolved and I have not evolved, you know. I still wear a tweed jacket, and you know, I don't really recognize myself in modern fashion at all.
Last question, favorite breakfast restaurant and your favorite breakfast meal? Because I'm a big breakfast guy.
That's so funny that you asked that, because I have a passion for diners. And, you know, that's probably why I live in the United States. And, you know, people think that as a Frenchman, I much prefer a sophisticated meal, but I will tell you something. I much prefer quantity over quality, which makes me deeply American. And so there's a diner right next to me called the City Diner. And I have dinner with my kids once a week at the City Diner. I love it.
And what's your favorite breakfast?
Oh, I get steak and eggs. I get steak and eggs and fries, you know. So I have a pretty bulky meat section.
Fabrice, no one would expect that you'd be LGBTQ having steak and eggs. This is like, sounds like, you know, the guy right on Wall Street, you know, who's a member.
And look, this is the perfect conclusion, right? Is that, you know, we have to drop stereotype about gay people, right? In the boardroom.
Yes.
Is that my candidates tend to be the type that will eat steak and eggs in the morning at a diner, you know?
Fabrice, all the best. Keep it up. And thanks everyone for watching. And if you like what you see, like us and follow us, www.veritascorp.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It really means a lot, Anthony. I talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.